Welcome to this edition of Inside Compliance. My name is Eric Moorhead. I'm Vice President and Senior Compliance Counsel with NYSE Governance Services. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Paul Gennaro, Senior Vice President and Chief Communications Officer for AECOM, a multi-billion-dollar global provider of professional and technical management support services. He leads an award-winning communications team. It includes recognition from the Public Relations Society of America and individual honors for Paul, including the 2010 International Business Award for Communication Executive of the Year. Prior to joining AECOM, Paul held leadership roles with Johns Manville, Ingersoll Rand, Dell, and American Express. He began his career as a print broadcast journalist and public affairs officer for the U.S. Navy. And I'm pleased to have someone with expert communication knowledge to talk to us about the interface between ethics and communication. And I'm going to dive right into that question by asking you, why do you believe ethics and communication are so vitally important for organizations?
Well, first off, thanks very much for the kind words, Eric. Delighted to be here. The reason that we're so passionate about it is there's a growing amount of data that indicates that audiences and stakeholder groups that are key to organizations are making decisions that are critical to those organizations based on how they view an organization or a company from an ethics and transparency standpoint. So whether it's an individual deciding, do I want to work for this organization or continue to work for the organization, a customer or client deciding whether or not I want to buy the products and services, an investor deciding whether or not I want to invest in this organization or recommend someone else do so, or a legislator or regulator deciding how hard do I need to govern this business, this industry. They're increasingly asking the question, is this an organization, is this an industry that can be trusted? We're seeing it with data such as the Edelman Trust Barometer. Edelman, one of the world's largest, in fact, the world's largest public relations firm, does an annual trust barometer measuring trust, public trust, globally for business, for the media, for government, for NGOs. And the results for the last few years have been pretty alarming. So there's a low trust factor. Hill & Knowlton, another public relations firm, they do a sustainability index on a quarterly basis. And what they found, they asked a question, they said, if an organization is transparent, even in telling you where they fall short in certain areas, does that increase your trust? And 82% of respondents said so. And lastly, Harris Interactive does an annual reputation quotient, and it measured 6 dimensions of the brand. The one that has been most impactful over the last few years, growing in its impact, is the social responsibility, that dimension that really ties in ethics. Now, in past years, it might have been financial performance, it might have been emotional appeal, products and services, but what we're seeing is all of these audiences are making decisions that are key to us based on, do they trust us? So from a communication standpoint, I want to drive that internally, and it's got to be genuine and authentic, but I want to drive it internally within our culture for our employees and then differentiate our brand as an organization that can be trusted.
And that trust is sometimes shaken by these high-profile failures that are due to risks. When you look out at the ethics and compliance environment out there, what are, say, top 3 risks that you see, and what are some ways that ethics and compliance and communication professionals can take those head on?
Yeah, and that's a great point. We talk about trust. I think first off, trust is number one. And what you find is when an organization stumbles and loses trust, it affects not only that organization or that industry, but it affects the entire corporate community. It affects business overall. People lack trust in business. So I think that's number one. And number two, I think from a threat standpoint, is on the flip side, if you have organizations that are professing disingenuous values, so they're saying we're ethical when they're not, sooner or later the true self comes out. Paul Argenti, who's a professor, excellent professor at Dartmouth and is a leader and thought leader in corporate communications, he wrote an article for Ethisphere magazine talking about, and he gave several examples, and I'm not going to cite them, but several examples of organizations professing disingenuous values that eventually got themselves into trouble. And I think that damages not just those organizations, but again, this greater public perception of corporations. And the third risk, I would say, organizations that aren't proactively driving that ethical culture. Because when you've got a global organization, people are making decisions every day. And sooner or later, someone somewhere may be confronted with a situation, an ethical question, and they may not be sure what's the right way to go. So I think organizations need to continually reinforce that internally, make it part of the culture. It can't be a once a year sign a code of conduct type of thing.
And when you talk about driving the culture, a key component that we've been talking about in ethics compliance for a long time is tone from the top, what's happening in the C-suite. What are some ways that communications and ethics professionals can drive the C-suite in this arena?
Well, I think the tone at the top has to be genuine, and that's where I'm very fortunate. Our president and CEO is a gentleman named Mike Burke. When Mike took the CEO role, that was the first thing he talked about, integrity. Integrity and ethics has to be first and foremost, and that echoed the theme from John Dionisio, his predecessor. So the tone of the top in our organization is very genuine. It's said, and then it's also modeled on a daily basis. I think the key is, how do you then take that throughout your organization and make sure it's cascaded down throughout the organization so folks can see and believe that this organization values ethics. It's not just something we say, it's key to who we are. And that's one of the things we've been pretty effective at doing at AECOM.
And implicit in that, I think, is the role of the ethics and compliance officer. How can, and our audience is comprised of quite a few ethics and compliance officers, how can they help that process and drive that culture?
I think Susan Frank, who's our Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, is a great example. She came to me in my communications role and said she'd like to partner up and let's try to drive this. Now, in the past, I'll be honest, the other organizations I worked at, they all valued ethics, but our work on ethics and compliance might have been working on the code of conduct, promoting it, maybe a message here and there, reinforcing that. What Susan spurred us to do is really drive it internally on an ongoing basis. And the big aha for myself as a communicator is, guess what? Look at all the data I cited earlier. This really does enable us to differentiate our culture so people want to work with us, want to work for us, want to stay in the organization. It also differentiates our brand externally. So it's an opportunity for me to really do my job, manage the brand internally, externally, protect, preserve, and enhance it, at the same time working with my Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. So if the question is, what can other ethics and compliance officers do? And I said this at the American Bar Association conference last summer when I spoke. Go find your communicator, take them out to lunch, start spurring that discussion, that dialogue. How can you work together? Because the opportunities for success are very interdependent.
What do you think some of the other differentiators are between your past experience in driving that message at the other organizations you've worked for and other organizations you've seen, and what AECOM is doing?
I think it's two things. I think it really, I always say when I talk to colleagues, I think every CEO has a thing that's most important to them. And there's a lot of things, but my CEO at Mack Trucks was French. Renault owned Mack at the time. And I remember Pierre saying, the key is to make the most important thing the most important thing. And for us, it is ethics and integrity. So I think that's key. It has to be genuine. Your CEO has to feel that way, number one. I think number two, the other reason for the increased importance is the timing. We live in a time where you've got transparency, you've got social media, all of these things, anything that happens is public almost immediately. So you don't have the choice to not be transparent. Public expectations, all of your publics, all of those audiences I mentioned before, they have heightened expectations. So if you're in my role as a communicator and you're not focused on this, you're really going the way of the dinosaur.
You mentioned the vitally important role that ethics and compliance officers have in driving the message and assisting the C-suite and tone from the top. What do you see your role as Chief Communications Officer in spreading the message?
I see my role as a member of the team because, again, it's got to be genuine and authentic. So if an organization just puts out a code of conduct but they don't act that way, I can't create a false brand, a false perception if there's not fact there, because sooner or later it's going to come out. I think the key is, how do we work together? You talk about the C-suite, across the C-suite. So is human resources for any organization, are they driving behaviors when you talk about performance appraisals and values in the organization that drive an ethical culture? Everybody from IT to finance to legal, are we all working together to reinforce that as part of a culture? And I think it's been a differentiator for us. One of the surprising things for me at the American Bar Association conference was the appetite for that partnership that I heard from these lawyers from all over the country saying, we do want to work with communications. We see it as a cool opportunity to do what we haven't done before, I think, and try to drive that in kind of a partnered way.
And I see that too. I see more and more cross-functional approaches that organizations are taking where they're involving not just communications, but HR and the business units out there. And that leads me to my last question, which is, can you give us some practical methodologies that you've used at AECOM to kind of spread the word from your role as a communications director?
So one of the things we do is we say, all right, let's look at all of our communication channels, all of our vehicles. How do we reach our employees? Because what we found is some employees prefer to go to the intranet, and they're not apt to read email newsletters. Some will only watch the videos. Some will never watch a video. So what you have is every new channel comes on board. We use Salesforce.com's Chatter, which is an internal social networking tool. Every new channel that comes on board, you've got to leverage that and reinforce that when you're reaching out to your employees. So I think it's, what do? We do everything. We have an annual ethics week. One of the things that's been great working with the Ethisphere Institute, we've done now 2 best practices in ethics communications workshops. And for each of those workshops, we've produced a report, and they're free for download on ethisphere.com's website. But if you go there, you can see what are leading organizations, whether it's an AECOM, whether it's a General Electric, whether it's an AFLAC, what are these leading organizations doing to drive an ethical culture? We picked up a great best practice idea from General Electric at the first workshop. They did a video competition for their employees to go out and create humorous videos talking about ethics, and it worked out phenomenally well. We did it at AECOM, had the same type of success. People had a lot of fun. They talked about a lot of issues, and Ethics Week, if you can believe it, actually became become a fun annual event for the organization.
So I think the key here is leveraging resources you have internally already with those relationships, but also finding out what other organizations are doing, what the best practices are, and seeing if those will work as well.
I would say, yeah, and the last thing I'd leave you with, because sometimes I have these conversations with folks in a communications role, and they say, well, I wish I had the time to do that. And what I would tell them is, if you're a manager for your organization and you want to proactively manage risk, if you drive an ethical culture, you decrease the likelihood that someone somewhere will act unethically. You increase the likelihood that if they do, someone somewhere will say something immediately that that's not the right thing and self-report. And the difference between that can be no penalty if that person doesn't do anything wrong or if it's self-reported, versus fines. You've seen some of these newsletters that come out that talk about fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars of range. So I think a smart, wise investment of time in protecting your brand up front pays huge dividends.
And that's what we're all looking for, I think. And I'd like to thank you for joining us today, Paul.
Great, thanks a lot. Delighted to be here, sir.
And thank you for joining us as well for this edition of Inside Compliance. We look forward to seeing you next time.